Right. So this is our scrap kitchen gardening series. I don't have my handouts printed out, so I'm sorry about that. We'll just be kind of looking at the handouts that are on the iPad here. But we have a couple handouts that we're going to kind of go through today and have some times just kind of talking through and demoing how to prep some of our scraps to regrow them. This is not a super fast process. Like the herbs that we'll talk about are really grow really quickly, root really quickly. But a lot of the vegetables that we'll be talking about are not fast regrowers. So some of these take a little extra time as well. But we'll kind of go through that as we go through some of the different vegetables here. So the first thing I want to kind of jump into are herbs. Now, if you have fresh herbs, they regrow so well. And so I have in the handout just a variety of herbs that do really well in regrowing in water. So if you go to the grocery store and you get like a bunch of fresh herbs, you can actually stick it in a cup of water and regrow it and then cut it down, cut pieces off as you need. And so I have a couple examples here. So first, when you get the fresh herbs, you can always put them in a cup and then stick them in the fridge. Put them in a cup of water, and that'll help them last longer. Not just like leaving them in a bag in the fridge. Adding that little bit of water helps them last longer. However, if you're wanting to root them and get more, regrow them, the best way to do that is stick it in a bottle so that the ends of the herbs are not touching the bottom because we want to regrow those, root them. We want to root those herbs. Now, herbs you can grow year round in water. You don't have to take them out and plant them in soil. You can leave them in water. Once you put them in the bottle, and you can leave them on the windowsill or in a spot where there's a lot of natural light. These I started probably 4 days ago, 4 or 5 days ago. And already I've got, let me pull it out. Already I've got a tiny little root that started. So herbs will start to regrow quickly. Once it starts rooting, I can, if I want to, stick it in some soil and put it in a sunny spot inside. But these herbs do grow really well just staying in water. The key thing to remember whenever you're doing the herbs, though, is that you do want to change that water out every now and then. And so all you have to do is just kind of dump it out and stick those herbs back in with some clean water. They don't really need anything else, just a little light and that clean water. And then as you're going through, you can cut off what you need, cook with it or make tea or whatever it is, and then put it back and let it keep growing. That's the really nice thing about the herbs. And herbs, sometimes they can feel a little expensive, excuse me, a little expensive when you get them from the grocery store. But the truth is, like these herbs will continue growing and will really flourish. Some of the best herbs that regrow are going to be things like basil, mint, and cilantro, those type of herbs. Herbs that are a little more woody, like rosemary, that'll grow really well in the water. But sometimes those woody herbs need that soil. So even just sticking them in a pot of soil and then adding them to a windowsill or a sunny spot, it'll grow and really flourish too. Rosemary is a sturdy plant. But these herbs are just a few examples. There are so many other herbs that grow really well. And I think if you're new to scrap kitchen gardening, scrap gardening, that herbs are a really great place to start. They're really sturdy, and they don't, and they root really quickly, which is nice, for sure. Has anyone ever done regrown some herbs before? I see I see a few people in the chat talking about the herbs too. Has anyone tried the herbs? I'm going to remove the spotlight for just a moment. Tried doing herbs. It's okay if you haven't. Just curious. Yay. Excellent. Excellent. Are there any questions? Yeah, so that's really good. I see in the chat there's a question about or some difficulty with cilantro. It's interesting when you're regrowing the herbs, like sometimes like herbs need a lot more, some herbs need a lot more sunlight than others. And so cilantro may definitely be one of them that needs some more sunlight. So always keeping those herbs like in a sunny spot, like on a windowsill in the kitchen, or just a sunny area where they can get some natural light is good. One of the things that I do, because I have a lot of windows in my house, but I don't have a lot of windows that are like get a lot of sun. There's a lot of trees in the way. And so I utilize plant lights often. And I will say, as someone who uses plant lights, that they have definitely revolutionized my indoor gardening game. So if you have done plant lights before, you definitely know that they can be really great. Um, yeah. So, there's a really great comment coming up about root rot, and that's a really good or a big concern, I think, whenever you're doing any kind of growing in water or rooting in water. I think one of the things that can help prevent root rot is just keeping an eye on the type of water that you're using, cleanliness of the water. So changing that water out and making sure you're getting new water in there can help with that too. And you want to make sure you're paying attention to the temperature too. You don't want it in a space where the temperature is going to drop and get really cold, or where there's a lot of change in temperature. So if you keep these like by the stove, and there's a lot of heat that comes off of it, and then that heat, like you get room temperature again. That's not always the best for plants, so keeping them away from like that stove is better. But the big thing is like making sure you have that clean water.
Can I direct you to two earlier questions in the chat?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
first one is, if you cut the herbs to use them, where is the best place to cut them on the stem?
Ooh, that is a really great question. So I'm going to pull out one of my mint leaves here. Here we go. So if you are cutting your herb and you want to root it, right? You want to make sure that you have at least two nodes, right? And so the nodes are where the leaves hit the stem. And so for the mint here, I have four nodes. I have one here, 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 and then up here at the top. Right. So those are four nodes. So I want to make sure when I'm trying to root it or trying to grow it that I have at least two. So for this one, if I want to prune some of it off to eat, let's say to brew in some tea or to add to some ice cream or like add it to cookies or something like that, I want to make sure whatever I cut off that I'm, again, leaving at least two of those nodes. So for this mint leaf here, I can actually cut off the top two nodes. Okay. You can also, instead of cutting them off, you can pull off just like bits of leaves. So, for example, if I don't want the stem, if I just want a couple leaves to add to a tea, then I can pluck the leaves off the bottom. But again, you still want to make sure that you're leaving two nodes, at least two nodes, to help it grow. That's a really good question.
Awesome. Another one is, when you put it in the water, do you need to wrap foil around the base to keep light and mold from the roots?
You can if you want to. Like sometimes that helps. Again, the main thing that helps, is keeping an eye on the water. You don't want the water getting like cloudy or dirty. You don't want a lot of debris in there. And so making sure that you excuse me, keep an eye on the cleanliness of the water is a big help. If you want to get like a colored bottle, that also works. That's a way to do it. Foil is a good way to kind of block the light from getting to the roots as well. Yeah.
And then just generally a bunch of questions about fertilization, changing the water, type of water, etc.
Yeah. Always good questions, great questions. Now, herbs you can grow year round in water. And so this one, I started this about 4 days ago. My bottle is a little cloudy, but that's because it's the type of bottle that I was using. But you want to make sure that your water is pretty much clear. Right. So there are some like rooting powders that you can use. So when you cut let me pull this out. So when you cut your herb to reroot it, you can dip it in that rooting powder and put it in the water, and that encourages root growth. I don't always use that, but it is helpful. But you don't necessarily have to add fertilizer to the water. You can. There are a lot of, like, Miracle-Gro, I think, has a brand out there that you can add to water to regrow herbs too. We do have a series that's a hydroponic gardening series where we're actually growing different vegetables and herbs in a water tank. And keeping it in there the whole time. And so, of course, for things like that, you want to add the fertilizer. Fertilizer definitely helps. But for your herbs, it's not absolutely necessary. Good questions. Yeah. Perfect. All right. So if other questions come up about the herbs, definitely jump in and ask. That raise your hand icon or putting it in the chat. But I'm actually going to move on to some of the vegetables now. So in the handout, there were 2 pages on different types of vegetables and just like a quick process on how to regrow them. Some you start, the 2 pages, some you start in water to help root it, promote that root growth, and then you add it to soil. Others you start in the soil. So I'm going to kind of go through some of these different vegetables here and talk about how to prep them to start that root growth. And again, if questions come up, please jump in and leave those questions in the chat or the raise your hand icon so we can kind of go through it. So in the handout, the very first one that's here is talking about green onions, things like fennel, leeks, lemongrass, those type of vegetables. And so I have an example here of a green onion. And so to cut it off, you'll see that the green onions, usually when you get them from the store, they have little roots on them already. And when you cut them to use them in salads or baking or whatever, we use most of the green. We don't use technically all that bulb. And so if you want to regrow the green onion, you want to cut it right around that white area. And so I'm just going to take a knife and just chop a little bit off. And so you want about a little more than like half an inch, about an inch, somewhere in that measurement. And you'll see that there are roots, like I said, roots already growing. And so what I'll do is I'll stick that in some water. And so these are some that I started last week, and you can see the roots are growing quite a bit in the water. But this new one, I'm just going to stick in so the roots are down. I want to make sure that when I stick it in the water to grow, that the end that I cut is above water. So it's mostly just getting those roots in the water. And you can see already that I've got a little new growth that's coming from those green onions. So what I'd say for these green onions is that these guys right here are getting really close to being harvested, right? They're really, really close to start growing. That little bit is there. And once they start growing that little bit, they'll start growing really quickly. It's just that beginning stage where you're trying to get a little of those roots, and a little growth does take a while. So this was about a week of growth when we start seeing it. And again, we want the root side in the water, and the part that's cut, we want sticking out. Right? And so it doesn't need a lot of water. You can see I have just a tiny little container here that I've got it in, and just a little bit of water. And I'd say maybe once a week, dumping that water out and putting some new water in. And then, of course, you can use the green onion right away to cook with. Great. Now, the next thing I want to talk about that's in the handout is our vegetables like lettuce, bok choy, celery, these type of vegetables here. See, so I've got a head of lettuce here, leafy green here. And usually when you get them from the store, you have that end on it. This is the part we don't eat, right? We eat the rest of it, obviously. And so what we can do is, again, we want to cut off that end, and you want to do kind of at least an inch and a half. Just cut that off. And so you can use this part right away. And this is the part that you'll want to regrow. right? So here is where the roots are going to start coming in. And so when we put that in water, this is something that we want to start in water and then transfer to soil. The lettuce here, you'll do the same with celery. When you get the celery, cutting that end off about an inch and a half. You want a good hunk on that bottom, and then you can stick it in a little bit of water. And so what I typically do to start that rooting is I'll get like the bottom of a Tupperware or a to-go container. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, and just kind of stick it in there and add a little bit of water. And just like those green onions, I'm going to add some water really quickly. Just like those green onions that we just did, you don't want that cut part in the water. You want it above water. So just a little layer of that, excuse me, is good enough to start that rooting process. Right? And like I said, those roots will come, they'll start coming a little slowly. But one of the things that you want to do for like the bok choy, the lettuce, the celery, you want to make sure that you're keeping the top a little moist. So spraying it a little bit with water, maybe twice a week. Is really good for it. And so this is how it's starting. You can see just the root there. We're cutting that top off. And this is an example of something that started maybe 5 days ago. And so you can see a little bit of the growth already coming and a little bit of the roots starting to poke out. So this is a good start. And this is, I would say, I would, like in the next day or two, I would put it in soil. And now when we put something like this in the soil, we want to cover it completely and let that new growth be the only part that's sticking up. Right? And so that's the case with celery too. So I have an example of the celery. Again, I've got some new growth that's coming in. There's not a lot though, so I'm going to let it stay in the water until it has some new growth that's coming up. And once that new growth starts, then we can stick it in the soil. And again, these are not the fastest plants to regrow. They'll take a little while, but they do grow and they do produce quite a bit. Yes. So when you are in the grocery store and you're shopping for vegetables and herbs, organic herbs definitely are going to be a better choice. But all vegetables will regrow. All the vegetables that we're talking about will regrow whether they're organic or not. It's a really great question. Yeah. And so this is kind of how to do those type of vegetables, like I said, the lettuce, bok choy, those things. And the truth is you can keep them all in the same container. It doesn't have to be an individual container for each of them. Having one container, one Tupperware with several of them in there is good too. And just like those green onions, you want to keep an eye on the water and make sure that water is clean and that the water is still there. So you may need to add water to it. And then just spraying a little bit of water. So if you have a spray bottle, where I keep my regrowing vegetables is on a big windowsill by a sink. And so I can just take the spray handle of the sink and just give it a little spritz on the top. And that's good too. And so I'm going to move that one over. Here, I see a couple of questions coming up. Yeah, so when you are, let me pull this one out again. So when you are regrowing, like this is the lettuce that I had, when you're regrowing it, I'm going to let it grow for another day or two and then stick it in the dirt. And when I cover it in the dirt, put it in the dirt, I want to make sure that I'm covering everything except for that new growth. That new growth is the only thing that I want above the soil. Yeah. Okay. And not every vegetable will regrow. Not every vegetable will regrow in water, but a lot of the vegetables will, especially the vegetables that we're talking about today. They're pretty sturdy vegetables, and there's a high chance that they'll be able to grow pretty easily in the water. Yeah, and you can put different plants inside the same container. So if I'm doing like a lettuce, a celery, and maybe like a potato, I can start growing all of them in the same container. It's okay. It's not that they're going to stay in the container because all of them need to be replanted in soil. So there's no worry about like the roots mingling and getting some weird vegetable because of the, the mixing. Yay. All right. So let's move on. I mentioned potato. So let's talk a little bit about root vegetables. So if you have like a potato or a beet, like I have here, um, sweet potatoes, carrots, any type of root vegetable, you can actually regrow them as well. Now, these are going to take much longer than the other vegetables, regrowing the other vegetables, but you can still grow root vegetables. And because it is a root, we're not trying to really root the root, right? So we want that new growth. So when you're doing something like a beet, here's the bottom of the beet, the top is what I want to use, right? So when I go to prep it for regrowing, I'll cut off the top. We don't need a whole lot, right? Just that little bit, but I want to make sure that the top where the leaves grow, that's going to be sticking out of the water, right? We don't want it completely in the water. And we can see here, we don't want it completely covered in the water. We want the end sticking up. So whatever container that you use that you fill with water, you want to make sure that it's not a high level of water because we just want that small part in the water. And just like with the other vegetables, you want to make sure you're changing the water maybe once a week, every few days, and you'll start to see some new growth come out of the top of that beet. And the same with potatoes too. Potatoes, because it is a root, you can cut off one of the ends the same way. And of course, we know when we have like these vegetables that sit on the shelf or in basket for a while, they start, the eyes start sprouting. Yeah, if they already start sprouting, that's perfect. Just cut that part off and use that, stick that in the water and let that grow even more. And when you plant it, when we go to plant that beet or the potato, you want to make sure you're putting the whole part of the old, like the root, right, in the soil. So it's just the new growth that's sticking out. Trying to
I
catch
have a
questions
bunch of
into it.
questions in the chat
Yes,
for you whenever you're ready for them.
yes, please give it to me.
Awesome. One question is, can you keep it hydroponic after rooting, which I think is in the handout as well.
You're talking about the vegetables
I believe
or
this was back with the vegetables, yes.
with yeah, so you don't want to keep like the vegetables that we've talked about so far, you don't want to keep them in the water the whole time. They have a greater chance of like root rot. And so these vegetables, once they start rooting, you do want to transfer them to soil. You can grow them, especially if you're growing them indoors, you can grow them year round. I would say if you are growing indoors, that it's definitely worth it to invest in a plant light to help with that because I know in certain seasons, there's just not a lot of sun coming in the windows. And so the plant light will definitely help. But going back to keeping it hydroponic, that's hard, like that's not a good idea, the best idea for the vegetables that we've talked about here. And for root vegetables, just in general, root vegetables, it's very difficult to keep them alive hydroponically. And so you want to keep those, like once they start rooting and sprouting, definitely transfer them to soil too. Um, and I didn't mention, but with the beet and the potato, you can do carrots the same way, chopping off the top where that new growth is or where the end of the carrot comes and sticking that in the water so the end comes up as well.
That perfectly leads us into the question of what lights do you recommend for growing?
Yes. So there are a bunch of plant lights out there. If you're doing vegetables, like what we're talking about today, the main thing to keep in mind is that you want a full spectrum plant light. There are a couple different types of plant lights out there, some that are specific for flowers, some that are specific for fruit, and some that are specific for vegetables. And the vegetable ones, you just want to make sure that it says, if you're doing vegetables and herbs, you want to make sure it says full spectrum. So there are some different brands out there, but the brands aren't as important as that full spectrum, seeing that full spectrum on there. And full spectrum is the yellow, blue, and red light. So you'll be able to see all those different colors in there. And I've used so many different types of plant lights, clamp lights, ones that you screw into a ceiling, the halo lights that you can actually stick into the pot that has a little ring light on top. But you can also, the cheaper way to test it, to get into plant light is I've gone to get just a regular clamp light, not a plant clamp, but a regular clamp light, and just got a full spectrum bulb, plant bulb to screw in. And sometimes that's cheaper or easier to get your hands on than going out for that full spectrum plant light too.
That also leads us into more questions about materials. So there are questions about what's the best soil to use, what are the best pots, and then while you're on that, also how deep should that soil be to leave room for new roots?
Oh, these are great questions. Yes. So, soil, the best soil, the really great, the really great thing about buying soil now is that you can actually see on the bag, they'll specifically say, this one is better for orchids and succulents. This one's better for flowers. This one's better for vegetables. And so this one's better for outdoors. This one's better for pots. And so just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking for soil. Of course, there are some big name like Miracle Grow and Scott's and like, you know, some big name ones that are, of course, going to be really good. But just kind of keeping an eye on the packaging for these will be in pots. And if you are growing indoors, that's something you want to find like indoor pots for vegetables, right? And so when you're growing something like the root vegetable, like the beet or the potato, you're going to need a bigger pot because that's going to grow deep down. If you're doing something like the celery or the lettuce, you don't need something as deep. So here is an example of the pot that I would use. This one is for my, I would use this one for celery, the lettuce, those type of plants. And so it's a, hold on, it's an 8-inch pot. And so that's a good, kind of a good starter one if you're doing that celery or lettuce.
Awesome. Have you ever had problems with fruit flies with your inside sprouts or plants?
Uh, Sometimes, yes. It comes, especially when there's a lot, like during the summer, sometimes I have like a more of a problem with that. But again, a lot of it is like just keeping an eye on the soil. You want to make sure you're not overwatering it. You want to make sure it's getting enough light. And if you're doing it with the water, like doing the propagating in the water, again, you want to make sure that you're changing that water out too. Once it starts rotting or a part of it that goes bad, that's when those fruit flies or little bugs start coming in and pestering. So if you do see those bugs, check your different vegetables that you're growing just to make sure they're in okay condition. But all that being said, just keeping an eye on the moisture content of the soil and if there's any kind of root rot or damage that's growing on those vegetables, you want to come back, cut them back.
We have so many great questions. I can just keep going, but cut me off if you ever want to continue on. But someone says fungus gnats solution in response to, I think.
Ooh. So Laura and I were actually just talking about this beforehand. So like this is a monthly series. And so for this first session, we were talking about prepping our different vegetables and herbs to regrow. In our session next month, we're going to actually spend more time talking about how to add some different nutrients to the soils. So if your soil is needing more or if the plant you're growing is needing more acid, like something like a ginger root or mushroom that you're growing, the different things that you have around the house that you can add. You can add coffee grounds. That gives enough acid to the soil, enough nitrogen to the soil to really help help that the ginger root or whatever it is grow. Different tricks like eggshells and banana water and stuff like that. So that's actually something we're going to be covering in depth next month too. So a little heads up there.
Awesome. Going back to the pots for a second, how does the drainage matter for the type of pots you're getting? Does it need to have that drainage hole?
Yes, you're gonna need you don't want that water um pulling up pooling. Whoo, my southern falls out every now and then. You don't want that water pooling up in the bottom of the container. So you want to make sure that you have good drainage. So whether that's the like this one is it's got the tray already attached to it. You can water down here. I forget what they call these plants or these pots, but that type of container is really great. Self-watering is really great. But you do want to make sure you have some good drainage. Some of the things that I do when I'm first like prepping my pot for soil is I have like a screen that I can cut in a little bit of a circle and cover the hole. So the soil isn't like clumping and blocking that. There's that screen there to help that water drain through to the tray that's underneath. You can also do that by putting some small pebbles or rocks at the bottom too to help that water drain through. So you do want good drainage, definitely.
Great, and I have just three more questions for you. Two of them are about timing. So they're wondering what time of year can you transfer root vegetable scraps outdoors? And also, do you know about how long till harvest for each item?
Yeah, so good question. Harvest time definitely varies. So for the root vegetables, that's going to be about 5 months, 6 months. It'll be half a year for the root vegetables. So you can harvest before you can harvest those. For the others, they're a little faster growing. So like for the celery, the lettuce, the bok choy, the green onions, those are going to be faster growing and you'll be able to see them. Like I said, with the lettuce that I have with this lettuce here, this was less than a week it started growing. So you can see that's going to start growing really quickly and probably in another like 2, 3 weeks, I'll start being able to pull off some of that lettuce to start eating. So some of that stuff is really fast, some it takes a lot longer. The transferring uh, the vegetables outside, that's a little different, a little trickier. So we can you can grow inside the root vegetables. Definitely, if you're regrowing those, you want to take them outside. They are going to need more space and more sunlight too. Um, I it's a good question. Probably in, I'd say around like mid-spring, early summer, would be a good time to transfer those. But again, that kind of varies. So I had to like work that out in my head. But that varies depending on what type you're trying to regrow too.
Awesome. And our last one to bring us back to the root vegetables and on is can you be more clear with the carrot, please? When you said the end to cut off, did you mean the pointed end or the end where the leaves grow?
Yes, good question. I realized that the one vegetable I didn't have with me was the carrot. So it's not the pointy end. You want the part where the leaves grow. That's the part you want to chop and put in the water. True. So I guess maybe the top of the carrot if it grows down. Not the pointy end, the side with the green. Good question. Hmm. So let's continue on in our time here. Let's continue on. I want to talk about avocados. So I know that, we were just talking about root vegetables and how sometimes that's going to take half a year to grow. You'll get a good harvest with it, but it'll take a little while to start growing. But with an avocado, it's going to take a lot longer before you can harvest that one. It's kind of like regrowing a pineapple too. It may be a couple years for that, but like once it starts growing, you'll be able to harvest quite a bit from it. So if you're doing avocado, sometimes avocados can be really finicky. Not all the time do they regrow. I will say what I love about avocados is actually I don't always regrow them, but I use them for like dyeing material. So the skin and the pits are really great for dyeing fiber. So that's usually what I do with avocados because I've typically had trouble with it because they are so finicky. But what you want to do, let me move this out of the way. What you want to do is pull that pit out. Okay? And so I'm going to just really quickly cut into my avocado here. Yeah. And so we've got a nice pit here. And you want to just kind of pull that out and wash it off. I think that's the smoothest I've ever pitted avocado. But when you pull that avocado out, right, you have that dark skin on it. And so what you want to do before you start that rooting process is you want to soak it for at least 24 hours. And so what I have done is typically give it a little water in a cup and then put that avocado in there so it's submerged. If you do that for about 24 hours at least, it softens it enough so you can pull off the skin, that shell, and you can start rooting it. So in the handout for the avocado pit, it shows keeping it in the water for about 24 hours and then peeling off the skin and submerging part of it in water. What you can also do that I've seen that works really well is taking the pit and wrapping it in like a wet paper towel and then putting it in a Ziploc bag or a Tupperware where it's kind of airtight so that humidity and moisture can really get to it. And you can see that mine is starting to crack open, and this has only been just a couple days. And so that root is starting to come out as well. So you can leave it wrapped in the paper towel in that Tupperware for a few days so that root can start, or you can go ahead and put it on the, submerge it in the water. So after that 24 hours, right, you want to take toothpicks or skewers. So I've got 3 here. There we go. And you want to stab your avocado. It's hard to do without that pre-soak, basically. But you'll take that pointy end and stab your avocado. And that pre-soak for 24 hours helps soften it up enough that it makes it a little easier to add those toothpicks in. And then you can take your water, and I'm just going to use this one as a demo, but you can take your cup of water, or they have specific bases, and just set that avocado on top. And you want to fill the water up till it's touching the bottom of that avocado, because that's going to pull that root down. Right? And so these, I couldn't find my toothpicks, so I'm using tiny skewers. But whatever whatever you have that has a pointy end that you can stab your avocado pit with and let it soak in that water is good. Now the avocado is going to take a long time, just like those root vegetables, probably even longer than, obviously even longer than those root vegetables to grow before you can harvest. But you'll be able to harvest quite a bit with that avocado pit once that gets rooted and started. Now, one of my favorite things to regrow, what I use quite often, is ginger root. Ginger is something that is always fantastic to keep on hand. As someone who is a chronic migraine sufferer, one of the issues that I have with migraines is that nauseous feeling. And so what I'll typically do is take some ginger root and put it in some hot water to sip, or chew on the ginger root, and that helps kind of calm my stomach, calm that nauseous feeling. And so regrowing ginger root is actually like pretty easy. You want to soak it in the water, just like the pit, the avocado pit. You want to soak it a little bit, but my ginger root here is quite large, and so what I can do is cut or break off pieces like this. It doesn't have to be super tiny. I could do something this size, break them off or cut them. And so here I would probably do 4 out of this one. And I can plant those in the dirt and they can start regrowing. And then as I need ginger, I can cut off what I need and leave the rest in the dirt to continue growing. When you plant it in the soil, you want to plant it in the soil so there's just a little bit of that ginger sticking out. So when you plant it, like for instance, I'm not going to plant my ginger root down like this where it's long ways. I'm going to plant my ginger root where it's flat and there's a little bit on top. Now ginger really likes very acidic soil. And so those coffee grounds that I mentioned earlier, it's always good putting those coffee grounds, used coffee grounds, on top of your ginger root. But like I said, the ginger root is it grows really well. It's super sturdy, and you cut off what you need and let the rest grow. And so you can get this wonderful network of ginger ginger root in the soil that you can constantly pull from, which is really nice too for that ginger root. Hmm. And the ginger root too, it's not that it grows super quickly, but it just continues to grow. Oh, now my hands smell really good. Smell like ginger. Um, but that ginger root is a very sturdy plant. I have always had success with ginger, and because it just continues to grow, you can cut off of it constantly, which is really nice. Hmm. So the next one I want to kind of talk about, the next couple things I want to talk about are onions and garlic. Mm. And so with onions and garlic, we're going to kind of do those a little differently. You know, when we were talking about the root vegetables, we want the part that we cut to be in the water. When it comes to like the onion specifically, you want the root, right? That's what we want to cut off and use. With the beet vegetable, the root vegetables, we want the top where the green is, but for an onion, we want the root. And so what you would do is cut off the bottom part. You don't need a whole lot, right? Just that bottom part where the root is. And then with this one, you can actually immediately stick it in the soil. And when you stick it in the soil, you want to leave that top exposed. You don't want a lot of soil on top of it. You want the top exposed, but you want to make sure that root part is in the soil. So just a very, let's say a dusting of soil on top, a super ultra thin layer, and then that root part in the soil. And you can immediately put it in the soil and it'll start growing. And once it starts growing, it'll grow different sections, right? Different onions will come. You'll get more than one basically growing from it. There we go. And what you can do as you see them growing, you can break them apart, pull them off, and plant them separately. So this one onion will grow several onions that you can pull off and continue to grow separately. And so just setting that in the soil with a super light dusting of soil on top. Now with a garlic, you can do that clove, right? Just one clove. You want to kind of pull some of that skin off. And when you put it, you can put this one directly in the soil too. You don't have to root it in water, just taking it and sticking it in the soil. And you want to put it in the soil about halfway down. So you're going to stick it in the soil where half of it is covered and half of it is sticking up. Right? We want to make sure that the soil is very moist. It's a very saturated soil. And then it'll start growing too. This one is a good one to start growing because it's one that got stuck in the bottom of a container in our kitchen. And so it already has a little growth. But you can just stick, like I said, just half of it in the soil and it'll start growing pretty quickly. You'll get a nice bulb. Now, the bigger the clove you plant, the bigger the bulb that's going to grow. It's just how it is. But you will get a nice bulb. And going back to the onion too, you know, I mentioned with, slight side note, mentioned with the avocado, the pits and the skins are great for fiber dyeing. With onion skins, it's the same thing. You can save those onion skins and you can dye clothing and fabric and just like paper, wonderful things. Side note. And so that's the onion and the clove, or the onion and the garlic. You can stick them directly in the soil. The other things that we've talked about, water, doing the water first is really important to help that rooting start. But with these two, just sticking them right in the soil. But again, making sure that that soil is very saturated with water. And then the last thing that's on the handout that I just want to kind of mention is regrowing mushrooms. Mushrooms are kind of fun to regrow. And a lot of that is because they don't need a lot of sunlight and they like really moist soil. So you don't have to keep them in a space like a sunny spot. And basically, I don't have any mushrooms because all the mushrooms at the grocery store were kind of ugly, but gross. But when you're regrowing mushrooms, you want to plant that stem, and that stem you want to plant it halfway in your soil, just like that garlic, and you'll start to see growth. Grow pretty quickly with those mushrooms. So you're not planting the cap of the mushroom. It's just that stem that you're planting halfway in that soil. Okay. And then keeping that soil nice and saturated. Hmm. So I'm gonna pause right here. I know we've kind of covered a lot in a really short amount of time, but I do want to pause if there are more questions that are coming up about process or options.
A few more questions to throw your way, Ruth. There were three in the chat. And as we're answering these, if you have more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or use the react button to raise your hand, and we'll get to those next. So one question was when you're using coffee grounds, if you have sweetened coffee grounds, like flavored ones, do you need to rinse those before you use them? Are they still usable?
Oh, that's a really good question. Flavored coffee grounds. I feel like after you brew the coffee, that it's already kind of rinsed out a little bit. I think you might be okay just using those coffee grounds. But to be honest, I have not checked into flavored coffee grounds, so I'm not quite sure. I can definitely research that and come back next month with that. Start off with that one.
Awesome. And then can you show us again which end of the avocado goes in the water, or explain that one?
Hmm. For sure. Let me go back to my hands. My hands here. There we go. Whoop,
That is
wrong
not.
one. Those are not my hands.
There we
Thank
go.
you. Those are my hands. Um, so the avocado pit, you can see the point of the avocado is sticking up, but that's because my root is starting to grow out of the bottom. So once you soak it overnight, right, and you pull the skin off, you'll see that there's a crack that's starting to form. Right? And so typically it's towards the bottom. So that pointy end is sticking up. Sometimes you'll get like the a freak avocado, not freak, special avocado where the root is growing from the top, but most of the time the root is going to go from that bottom. So that pointy end you can stick up, and that's that rounded part you can put in the water. So, excellent question. You can do all these indoors if you have space. I will say, if you are doing like the herbs grow in the water and are perfect in a windowsill, if you're wanting to grow these vegetables once they're in the soil, wanting to grow them inside, you can do that. But I would definitely say it would be wise to invest in a plant light just to make sure they're getting enough light that way. But yes, you can keep them all inside. Most definitely. I wish I had the mushrooms to actually walk through that process, but that's a really great question. So when you're doing mushrooms, trying to regrow the mushrooms, you definitely just you don't want the cap, you want that stem, and you want that stem halfway through, like into the soil. It doesn't need to be a deep pot that you're putting it in because it's going to stay really shallow. If we look in nature, when we find most mushrooms, it's in very shaded areas where there's a lot of moisture. So it's not like a lot of sunlight, not a lot of deep soil. And so the pot that you use can be really shallow. And just like stick those stems in there. It'll take a few weeks before you see growth starting. But once that growth starts, you'll have a cap pretty quickly, and you can pull that off and start eating that. The best soil for these plants, if you are growing them in pots, you can definitely look for I mean, they're, like I said, they're big brands that are really great, like Miracle-Gro and Scott, like all these really great brands. But the main thing to look for when it comes to regrowing these vegetables inside is that you want to make sure that that potting soil is specifically for indoor vegetables or potted vegetables. If you're doing like fruit, of course, you'll need different soil for that. But for all the vegetables that we're talking about here, just getting soil that's specifically for indoor potted uh, plants, vegetable soil is good. That's a good place to start. Really great questions.
Awesome. If I have a couple more for you from earlier, that's all right.
Sure.
One person was asking, is it safe to put the food pieces in the water to root together with non-food plants like Hoyas?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, so when I do, um, it's- I'm a big fan of propagating. I always joke about how when I walk the dog, I always walk with a pair of scissors, because I may find some plants that I need to root at home. So, I love doing like propagating just across the board, whether it's vegetables, herbs, or just like, pretty plants to look at. But when I'm doing that propagating, I don't usually keep them in the same container. If you're doing those vegetables, like what we've talked about today, you can start that process all in the same container because you'll want that shallow water for it, right? So again, like for these rooted vegetables that we're doing, it's just a little bit of water that you're keeping in that container. You're not filling it up all the way. When you're propagating other plants, like if you are propagating like a philodendron or a begonia or another plant, you want that deeper container. So you'll want something that's more like a cup like this, where you can put that, well, more like something like this, so the bottom is not touching, the bottom of the plant is not touching the bottom of the container. But you'll want those stems to have space to grow and root. So it's a little hard to do it in the same container because they need different amounts of water. But you can regrow them separately pretty easily.
I have three more questions for you, but it is 5 minutes till the end of our time if you have any announcements first.
Yeah, so thank you, Laura, for keeping us on track. I am so grateful for our time together. It's always fun to talk about propagating and growing and planting. It's a lot of fun. I know we didn't have a whole lot of time to chat today, but we'll definitely have an opportunity next month as well. We're going to go a little deeper into basically fertilizing our scraps as they grow. But if there are any questions that come up in the meantime, definitely feel free to reach out to us at that contact at Mather email. No, Kits, the Kits email. Thank you. At our kits at Mather, KITS at Mather.com. And ask us that way or on Facebook page for sure. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can. Okay, so just want to shout that out.
Yes. Amazing. And yes, you do need to re-register for next session. This is not an ongoing class, so I put that link in the chat, just
Thank you.
emphasizing that again. So yeah, so three more questions that I think we have time for. One is the participant's water is very hard and has a lot of chlorine in it. Is it okay to use it?
Oh, that's a really great question too. Um, So the best water for rooting, like most of the time, you can do tap water. I would say when it comes to growing things in water, typically you want to stay away from well water because of the content in like well water. Generally, tap water is okay if you know that there are high levels of other like high levels of magnesium or high levels of chlorine or those other things and it using distilled water is a better route to go. So if you know you have like your pH balance is kind of like way off in one direction, that distilled water is a good way to go.
Awesome. Um, Someone was asking, they've never used grow lights before. If you have 5 or 6 pots, do you need a light for each pot, or is it just like as many as you have is great?
So that's a really great question too. So when you're using grow lights, and we can definitely spend time on that next month as well, doing a little demo with different types of grow lights. But it depends on the size of your grow light. If you have one small halo light that's like the size of your hand, then that's definitely a one plant kind of grow light. But for most clamp lights and the not string lights, the strip lights, you can do several plants under there. I have a hydroponic garden that has its own plant light on it. And I will generally stick other plants next to it because they can grow from that plant light too. So if you do have a plant light, it never hurts to add other plants to it. But you want something that's a little larger in size. Like I said, when it's that small, like halo light, that's definitely a one plant. It's not big enough to do more than that. But when you get those larger lights, you can definitely add more plants to it.
And then our last question, I think you're going to love ending with. The question is, can you restart scraps from plants grown from scraps?
Ah, yes. You can, which is exciting. Like it will give and give and give, which is really nice. I was actually, this is funny. Laura and I were talking about this earlier about like the green onions. So when you do root these plants, when you root them in water, it's good to transfer them to soil because once you transfer them to soil, they really start growing and then you can save those roots and reroot them again. But it needs to go into that soil. It has to have those nutrients. If you keep it in the water, it will continue to grow, but you're going to lose some of those nutrients that it gets from the soil. You're going to lose some of the flavor. So you want to make sure when you are rooting that you start the rooting in the water, transfer it to the soil. And then after you harvest from that, you can use those roots again, or the original plant to root in the water again. Really great questions. And I see our time is up, but if there are other questions that we've missed, one of the things that we can do is still answer those questions and just send them out through email. So those questions do get answered too, and everybody has access to them. So our time is up, and I just want to say thank you so much for being a part of this session. It's a lot of fun to talk about regrowing plants, especially from scraps, where we don't have to get all these fancy supplies. We can use the things that we're already using to grow food for ourselves. As always, if other questions come up outside of this time, feel free to reach out to us and definitely sign up for next month. We're going to talk a little more about some ways to fertilize and continue to grow our scraps. All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of the day. We'll see you soon. Bye.